Thank you, Mr Holloway. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. The doctor doesn't see me crawl on the floor. The doctor doesn't know I don't shower every day or brush my teeth twice a day like everyone else. He isn't aware of my frequent sore throats, my poor balance, my difficulties with reading, my muscle twitches or my sound intolerance. And he certainly wasn't here to nurse me when once I was too weak to eat. These are the words of a junior doctor living with ME, who alongside nearly 1,000 others have contacted me prior to this debate. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, has been described in many ways, but labels such as chronic fatigue syndrome or post-viral fatigue syndrome simply do not come close to the living hell experienced by many ME sufferers. A hell that is made worse by the lack of understanding that is faced when seeking help. ME is estimated to affect around 250,000 people in the UK and is classified by the World Health Organization as a disease of the central nervous system. Symptoms can include debilitating muscle pain, severe headaches, often made worse by light or noise, significant impairment of short-term memory, and post-exertion malaise that can last days and even weeks. I will.
Thank you for giving me. Congratulations on bringing this to Mr Hall for consideration. Would the Honourable Lady not agree that there is still huge concern amongst the ME patients that NICE will not abandon their promotion of physio-social therapies for ME despite the widespread scientific criticism of the PACE trial methodology, and that we must ensure that this is addressed as a matter of urgency?
Thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and I'll come on to the NICE guidelines later in this speech. Although ME is a pathological, not psychological condition, much about it remains a mystery. The reasons for this, I believe, are twofold. Firstly, many sufferers are housebound and therefore easy for society to ignore. And secondly, there is a lack of awareness amongst medical professionals, and as a result, a woeful lack of quality research. What we do know is that ME is often triggered by a viral infection such as flu, but unlike healthy individuals, people living with ME do not recover. And into this research drought entered the PACE trial. This trial was unique in medical research. It was funded by the DWP to a tune of £5 million, a point to which I will return. From the very start, the PACE trial was flawed. In contravention to WHO classification, it assumed ME was psychological, that sufferers could recover if they chose so to do, and thus the PACE trial was framed in psychological terms.
I think it's very important you got this debate today. But would you not agree with me that a lot of employers don't really understand how ME people suffer, and that can affect their employment as much as a housewife at home, and particularly women?
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose the public perception is it's just tiredness. It is so much more than just tiredness, and the debilitating pain that ME sufferers experience is something that we all should be aware of. The participants in the PACE trial received a range of different treatments, including Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, CBT, and Graded Exercise Therapy, GET, where patients were encouraged to become physically active and then increase the activity's intensity. Unbelievably, for a trial this large, none of the groups were given specific medical interventions. The results were published in The Lancet in 2011, with the contentious claim that CBT and GET brought 30% of patients back to normal, while 60% improved. The media reported that all ME sufferers had to do to recover was exercise. However, the report was immediately questioned by the patient community. How could exercise, the very thing that was known to worsen symptoms, actually help?
Thank you. My friend Jo from Leeds wrote to me and she said, I've had CFS-ME for 25 years. I've had it for 10 years before it was diagnosed. When I was diagnosed in Sheffield, I was told there was literally no service they could refer to me and relied largely on a local support group. I was told by a Leeds GP more recently to just get on with my life, despite trying to hold down a professional job, look after a young child. This is a typical story of somebody with ME.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. Of course, it's typical because the PACE trial had such publicity and was lauded by many as the answer. One participant in the original trial has contacted me. She says, I was determined to be part of this trial because I wanted to get better. So if this treatment could make me better, I wanted to give it the chance to do so. I was assigned graded exercise therapy. It never occurred to me that it would actually make me more ill, nor did it occur to me that the decline would not be documented, and that despite patients not recovering, or in some cases worsening, they would publish the treatment was successful. It was stressed I would only get better if I tried harder, and even though the graded exercise was making me worse, my struggle and pain was dismissed. I will do.
I thank you for giving way. As a former physiotherapist, I recognise that all therapeutic interventions must be patient-led, led by people with lived experience. Doesn't she agree?
Absolutely, and that's one of the calls I'll be making today, is that the patient voice is heard in any treatments. Calls to publish the raw data, basic protocol and good research were ignored. Queen Mary University spent an estimated £200,000 on keeping this data hidden. Finally, after a long battle, patients won a court order to force the PACE authors to release this data. It was discovered that the authors had altered the way in which they measured improvement and recovery to increase the apparent benefit of the therapies. Reanalysis shows that the improvement rate fell from 60% to just 21%. And the recovery rate from 22 to just 7%. The methods of patient reporting has also been questioned, as one participant says, after repeatedly being asked how severe my symptoms were, in the context of it's just me not trying hard enough, I started to feel like I had to put a positive spin on my answers. I could not be honest about just how bad it was, as that would tell them I wasn't trying and I wasn't being positive enough. When I was completing the questionnaires, I remember second-guessing myself and thinking after every answer, is it really that bad? Am I just not looking at things positively enough? Well.
I thank you very much for this debate. I mean, it raises an important issue. The PACE trials have been condemned roundly by many scientists as being totally inappropriate. Does she have a feel for what an appropriate trial might have found?
Yes, and I'll actually come on to how an appropriate trial could be done. But if I mention first of all the self-reporting that was part of this trial, this provided the data of the measurements of success, and it wasn't any physiological measurements or scientific measurements that were taken. For patients, the damage was done. I am a science teacher by profession, and I always told my pupils there are a number of stages to any scientific investigation. Start with a hypothesis, decide how you'll test this theory, what measurements you'll make, how you'll record your results, and how you will use these results to draw your conclusions. And these conclusions, which might be different from the original hypothesis, must be based on the evidence you have gathered, not the PACE trial. Rather than measurable physiological parameters, it relied on patient self-reporting. And when the results were not as expected, rather than revise the original hypothesis, they simply changed the success criteria. Thus, patients in GET who had deteriorated during the study were considered recovered. There are, of course, ways of measuring the physiological impact of exercise. The 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise test can objectively measure post-exertional malaise. We know that a person with ME can perform adequately or sometimes even well on the first day, but can have a greatly reduced cardiopulmonary function on the second day. So the test requires the participant to exercise on a static bicycle and allows data on oxygen consumption, workload, gas exchange to be measured. 2 identical tests separated by 24 hours must be carried out to properly measure the impact of exercise. Results from a single test could be interpreted as a lack of fitness. 2 tests change this to something quite different. A healthy person will perform better on the second day. An ME sufferer would most likely be worse. Of course, the failure of PACE to do this could simply be put down to bad science, but unfortunately, I believe there's far more to this. One wonders why the DWP would fund such a trial, unless, of course, it was seen as a way of removing people from long-term benefits and reducing the welfare bill. The PACE trial...
Grateful for the member, given we're speaking very, very well about the challenges that this condition, this illness, presents to people. But does she share my concerns that in Scotland there's only one specialist nurse-led ME facility, and there's no specialist ME consultants. And I do think she is raising a very important point, but in terms of NHS awareness of this condition, we need to be doing more to ensure that people are getting the treatment that they undoubtedly need.
Okay, this is a worldwide issue. The PACE trial results have affected people all over the world. I have in this folder people from Australia, people from the United States, from Canada. And whilst in Scotland there aren't any specialist centres, in England where there are, they're recommending graded exercise therapy, which is making people worse. So actually we need to deal with this. I'm going to make some progress. The PACE trial was used to inform NICE guidelines, which has meant that symptoms have been disregarded, sufferers are considered to be attention-seeking, hypochondriac, or even, for some female patients, hysterical. Although in some ways the lack of belief has been the most difficult thing for sufferers and their families, the impact of the PACE trial and the resulting NICE guidelines are far further reaching. Many sufferers have reported major issues in accessing financial support. ESA assessments do not consider the impact of exertion on a person's ability to function on subsequent days. And PIP assessments, which consider ME to be psychological following the PACE report, mean that sufferers struggle to access this entitlement and simply are relying on family members. Conflicts of interest in this trial are also deeply worrying. The former Chief Medical Advisor to the DWP sat on the trial steering committee, and ultimately the results of the trial have been used to penalise those with ME. When we consider then the relationship between key PACE investigators and major health insurance companies such as Unum, this trial takes on a far more sinister slant. Sufferers have reported that their health insurance would only pay out if they undertook a programme of GET, an impossible task, as the insurance giants knew. But it's not only adults who are affected. Children with the disease have been subject to care proceedings because of widespread misunderstanding amongst health workers. ME has been mistaken for school phobia, neglect, or even abuse. One mother, I will in a moment, one mother contacted me. She says, our 12-year-old son was seen at a specialist ME centre by a consultant who prescribed GET. In 1 year, this programme caused our youngster's body to develop higher and higher levels of inflammation. He began limping, was in continual pain, not only from the ME headaches, but joint and foot pain. The comments were made, well, he managed to limp into my office. You were very active. Now, since the virus, you're very inactive, so you will have this pain due to lack of exercise. GET caused his body's immune system to go into overdrive. My son developed juvenile idiopathic arthritis. This was treated by a paediatric rheumatology consultant who was shocked it had been left so long and told my son his toes would be permanently swollen even after treatment, as the bones had grown abnormally during the inflammation.
I've been contacted by parents from my constituency. Her daughter took a year to be diagnosed by it and missed an entire year of school as a result. The effect on children's lives at a very, very young age is palpable.
Yes, and many parents who try and homeschool their children then have local authority intervention trying to get the children back to school. We must listen to the patients. This is a disease that's very easy to ignore. All too often those living with ME are housebound and suffer from what they refer to as brain fog, which makes it difficult to mount an organised campaign. This means much about ME remains unknown. There is some evidence that it could be grouped with autoimmune conditions like MS and rheumatoid arthritis. Some people have reported that certain antiviral drugs improve their condition, but without properly conducted scientific research, we do not have the answers. Ultimately, the impact of the PACE trial on those with ME has been devastating.
I will. She's making a very good case on this. My constituent Caroline McGregor has had ME since 1996 and has been bedbound for 7 years. She says, I've lost my life, my husband, my health, my husband, my career and my home. Does she agree with my long-term family friend, Maureen Bavard, who says that this cover-up and the way that the PACE trial was carried out amounts to a miscarriage of justice to the patients?
I think when the full details of the trial become known, this will be put down as one of the biggest medical scandals of the 21st century. I'm going to just finish off. So I'm pleased that NICE are reviewing their guidelines on ME and have removed the recommendations to embark on harmful exercise. But I was contacted only last week by a lady who had been told recently by her GP to exercise her way to health. This highlights a huge need for education, raising awareness amongst both public and medical practitioners. So today I ask the Minister, can the next set of guidelines be drawn up through listening to those with ME? What plans does she have to introduce compulsory training for medical practitioners on ME care and treatment? Can she assure me that specialist ME treatments are not advertising graded exercise therapy as a method of recovery? Will she support proper funding for ME research? And lastly, will she work with colleagues in the DWP to ensure new guidelines are drawn up for dealing with people with ME? Finally, I'd like to thank the Countess of Mar and the ME Association who have helped me to prepare for today. And I thank those living with ME whose voice is not being heard.
The question is that this House has considered the PACE trial and its effect on people with ME. The debate can last until 11:30. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Holloway. It's a great pleasure to serve under your stewardship. I'd like to start by congratulating the Honourable Lady for securing this debate today. It's clearly, as she has articulated so beautifully, a very concerning situation. I know that she's done an enormous amount of work in this and has met people both in her own constituency and more broadly affected by the condition and those with more expertise in the condition to hear about the impact that it has on individuals' lives. And I think as constituency MPs, we all know people within our own constituencies who are affected by this condition. As we've heard, chronic fatigue syndrome, which is also known as myalgic encephalomyelitis or encephalopathy, is a debilitating and very poorly understood condition, estimating to affect over 200,000 people in England. We don't understand the underlying causes of it. There is no one diagnostic test to identify it, and although patients can improve and recover, there is no cure for it. The condition, which for brevity and to avoid covering you in a thin layer of spittle, Mr Holloway and I shall refer to in its abbreviated form of CFS-ME, can stop a life in tracks, leaving sufferers unable to carry out the most basic tasks. In the most serious cases, people can be bedbound for weeks at a time. It has a complex range of symptoms, including a very disabling fatigue-like flu malaise and neurological problems. The impact, of course, on friends and families and carers as well can be significant. It's also true that the difficulties in diagnosis means that patients with CFS-ME often experience delays in getting treatment and support that they need. In recognising the need for GPs to be aware of the condition, the Royal College of General Practitioners identifies CFS-ME as a key area of clinical knowledge that GPs should have as part of their qualifying exams, which I think answers one of the questions that she's raised. It's the recommended treatments for CFS-ME, namely Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, CBT, and graded exercise therapy, GET, and the evidence for them that, of course, are the subject of today's debate. And these treatments were first recommended for patients with mild or moderate CFS-ME in 2007 in the NICE guidance. The recommendations were made in line with the best available evidence, which showed these treatments offered benefits. Their guidance sets out the following. There is no one form of treatment to suit every patient, that the personal needs and preferences of patients should be taken into account, that doctors should explain that no single strategy will be successful for all patients, that in common with all people receiving NHS care, CFS-ME patients have the right to refuse or withdraw from any part of their treatment, and that those with severe symptoms may require access to a wider range of support managed by a CFS-ME specialist. The results of PACE trial, which stands for Pacing Therapy, Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, Graded Exercise and Specialist Medical Care for Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, were published 4 years after the NICE guidance. The trial ran from 2005 to 2011 and actually, contrary to what she says, was actually primarily funded by the Medical Research Council, not the DWP. The total amount of funding was £5 million, but the Medical Research Council contributed almost £3 million of that. It was undertaken by the Queen Mary University in London, was the largest ever trial for CFS-ME, including over 600 participants in England and Scotland. It sought to assess and compare the effectiveness of the 4 main treatments for CFS-ME: adaptive pacing therapy, CBT, GET and standardised specialist medical care. The peer-reviewed trial results published in The Lancet in 2011, as she says, found that 60% of patients with CFS-ME benefited from CBT and GET when provided alongside specialist medical care. CBT and GET were found to be better than pacing therapy or specialist medical care alone in improving both symptoms and disability, and a follow-up study looking at recovery after 1 year further supported the benefits of interventions. The trial had ethical approval from the NHS Research Ethics Committee and had ongoing oversight from an independent trial steering committee, which included patient representatives, and trial reports were regularly provided to a data monitoring and ethics committee, which had the power to halt the trial if harm was indicated. NICE considered the PACE results in 2011 and concluded they supported its existing recommendations on both CBT and GET. Now, the government is aware that the use of CBT and GET in treating CFS-ME has long been a controversial issue for patient groups, charities and some clinicians. This began with the publication of the NICE guidance 10 years ago and continued with the PACE trial. Since 2011, PACE trial data has been shared with many independent scientists as part of normal research collaboration, including the internationally respected research organisation Cochrane, that independently validated its findings. However, in the last 18 months, the attention on the trial has increased substantially following a tribunal ruling in August 2016 ordering the release of the trial data to a member of the public that she referred to. This data has since been examined more widely, and critics, including some clinical academics, have suggested it shows that CBT and GET are not as effective as trial results suggested. I will.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you, Minister, very much indeed. This is clearly a very important debate, and I think both the proponent and also the Minister would agree that in half an hour it's not possible to do justice to the concerns raised by all our constituents and the 200,000 sufferers that the Minister has identified. Would the Minister agree that this is a subject worthy of wider debate in the House of Commons, and that just because academics believe in the results, actually those constituents like Sarah Reid who've written to me to say actually because of the belief in CBT, GET, there are many other sufferers and treatments that have not been pursued? Does the Minister feel angry about that?
Mr Holloway, I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and of course, as has already been said before in this debate, it's really important that we do listen to patients, and as I will go on to explain, NICE are now looking at reviewing their guidance on this, and I think in the light of that, it may well be worth discussing this more fully. Yes.
Thank you, Minister, for giving way. Will the Minister agree that actually it's also about believing patients? That's important here, because as a condition that's often not believed at all, concerns around the PACE trial haven't been believed as well. That's just loaded concerns upon those individuals.
Yes, Mr Holloway, I think as I've already set out in my comments, sometimes it can take a really long time for this to be diagnosed, and people have to keep coming backwards and forwards to GPs and others with their symptoms, and many other potential conditions have to be discounted from inquiries before it can be fully diagnosed, and often leaving people feeling that their symptoms are not being taken seriously or they're being dismissed, which obviously is massively concerning, which is why, as we've already said, it's really important that patients are listened to and that clinical professionals are well equipped to be able to recognise the symptoms and be able to identify them. Now, I'll make a tiny bit of progress and then I'll be happy to. So, as I said, this data has been examined more widely. Critics, including some clinical academics, have suggested it shows CBT and GET are not as effective as the trial results suggested. Now, in turn, the trial authors have defended their work. They've responded to criticisms in medical journals and wider medical printed press. I know the Honourable Member for Glasgow North West raised one such criticism in the oral evidence session of the Science and Technology Committee in January concerning possible conflicts of interest held by PACE trial authors. On this point, I understand in line with normal practice, all such conflicts were published with the trial protocol as well as the results. But if she has evidence to the contrary, I'd be very happy to discuss that with her afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister, for that. However, they were not disclosed to the PACE participants.
It's very important that she raises that, and I'm sure that will be taken into consideration.
Very short of time. I think ME sufferers in my constituency welcome that the NICE guidelines are being reviewed, but one problem is that when they find the existing treatments don't work for them, there really is a lack of alternatives. Does she recognise that alternative treatments do need to be urgently looked into and offered to patients?
Well, I'm sure this will be part of the NICE guidelines, and where there are where there's significant evidence that alternatives are there and deserve greater investigation. I'm sure NICE will be looking at that. I'll go and talk about that in a little bit more in a second, if she'll bear with me. It's obviously important that researchers are talking about conflicts of interest. It's important, obviously, that researchers and scientists with a particular expertise in one area will, of course, have worked and shared their expertise in related fields and industries. But obviously, transparency regarding conflicts of interest is vital to the integrity of the research. While I understand the NHS Health Research Authority already issues guidance on conflicting interests, I understand it will be considering whether any further clarity is needed. Clearly, the controversy around this trial is problematic for researchers, but most of all, it's distressing for patients with CFS-ME who deserve the most appropriate treatment from the NHS, and to have confidence in the treatment that is being provided. And that's why we welcome the NICE decision to undertake a full review of the guidance, which will examine the concerns around the PACE trial and whether there are implications for its current recommendations. NICE develops its guidance independently to support the NHS organisations and clinicians to deliver services in line with the best available evidence. They welcome the input of stakeholders, and I understand that more than 10 CFS-ME charities and organisations are registered already to support the guideline development progress. All other parties who are interested can comment on the draft scope and draft guidelines at the appropriate time during the development process. Final guidance is expected in October 2020. Very quickly.
Indeed. She makes the point that the final guidance is expected in October 2020, but given the significant doubt over CBT and GET now and the impact that it's having, would she not recognise as a strong case for NICE to suspend the guidance that takes people towards those potentially damaging treatments at the moment?
Well, as an independent organisation, that of course will be a matter for NICE, taking into consideration the evidence as they do. I know it's a priority for the CFS-ME community that more research be undertaken into the identifying the underlying causes of this condition as well. I'd like to reassure those affected that both the MRC and the National Institute for Research welcome high-quality applications for research into CFS-ME, including studies to investigate its biological causes. It will therefore come as welcome news that the MRC is currently funding a project to examine the relationship between abnormal brain structures and symptoms for CFS-ME. Once again, I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Glasgow North West for raising this really important issue on behalf of those affected by the condition in her own constituency, but up and down the country as well, and I hope that this debate has been helpful.
The question is that this House has considered the PACE trial and its effect on people with ME. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.